What Joe Mixon is doing is about to become the new normal for sports media. Let's get into it. Joe Mixon was originally proven not guilty in his case, and shortly after came out and said that he would not speak to 4 Bengals reporters from companies that involved ESPN, the Cincinnati Enquirer, Pro Football Network, and Sports Illustrated. Not just all those companies, but one specific person from each of those companies. And this is the new normal in sports, as we've seen with the blow-up of player-specific podcasts, as we've seen it with Paul George and Draymond Green and Jeff T, just to name a few. Bengals fans and NFL fans mostly have been on Joe Mixon's side. There have been a few people that have been on the opposite side, though, and so just talk to the reporters. But if you look at some of these reporters, some of them I will not name. 2 of them were very obvious from the start if you just watch what they have covered Joe Mixon this past season. And it makes sense for Joe Mixon to take this route. Someone very close to Mixon reported to ESPN Bengals reporter Ben Baby with this, and he was one of the people that Joe Mixon alluded to not speaking to going forward. And no, Joe Mixon is not the first. If we've seen it with the famous Marshawn Lynch at the Super Bowl Media Day, I'm just here so I don't get fined. And there were people before Marshawn, and there will be players after Joe Mixon that take this route as well. And we've seen it with podcasting and with Paul George and his success of Podcast P, to where he can control the narrative and get out in front of something if something was to happen. Paul George's podcast has been widely successful, not just because of Paul George's willingness to speak and tell the truth, but just his willingness to dissect and digest and talk about the game. Love him or hate him, Draymond Green was a big part of this taking off of the podcast for players and getting and controlling their own narratives, as he signed with Colin Cowherd's The Volume Network very early on when that was created, and thus was born the Draymond Green Show. People joke about it where Draymond talks about after games and just talks about it, but it's also a good way for players to control the narrative and not have to rely on traditional media for them to get their word out. Now, I'm not saying Joe Mixon will go down the route of the podcasting route, but I'm not saying it's out of the question either. But he's definitely taking a stand against these reporters he felt did him wrong, and as a Bengals fan, I definitely see where he is coming from. Whether it be about his charges in his court case or to his contract situation, there were Bengals reporters out there that were pushing for the Bengals to cut Joe Mixon to save money, and that or saying that he was going to be cut, or saying that there was no way that he was going to be on the roster this upcoming season. And well, that was obviously all a lie. The athlete that's benefited the most from having their own podcast is Gilbert Arenas. Gilbert Arenas, the way that he was looked at throughout his career, whether it be just someone that was looked at as a shot chucker, and then obviously the gun incident that was following him all wrong. Gilbert Arenas opening his show and starting his show really changed the outlook on Gilbert Arenas. While yes, he has some outlandish takes and says some outlandish stuff, especially about the WNBA, a lot of it can boil down to people saying that they know Gilbert, that Gilbert Arenas just takes stuff one step too further. But it's opened a new look to Gilbert Arenas. People see that he actually has a great mind, not for just basketball, but for the NBA, and that he's also not that bad of a guy that the media tried to portray him back when the gun incident was happening. And then there's also JJ Redick with his podcast, The Old Man and the Three. And you could argue JJ has had one of the more easier transitions from playing career to media. And a lot of people you see, it's not just old players and former players that go on JJ's pod. He also has coaches and a lot of active players as well. As with the new athlete, they'd rather go on former players' podcasts or their own podcast and talk about and get their voice heard rather than go to traditional media. While local media will always be important to sports and athletes, more and more going into the future, we'll start to see where athletes rather get out their own words, whether it be with their peers on podcast or starting their own podcast. A lot of the examples used in this video are NBA players, but I think we'll start to see more and more NFL players, as we've already seen it with the boom of the Pat McAfee show and players going on there and talk with a former player and talk with the crew around Pat. I think we're starting to see that more and more with NFL players creating their own podcast. And no, they might not record right after a game, but you're definitely seeing it also with the Kelce's and their explosion of their podcast that's really taken off in the last year. Players and athletes are starting to realize that they don't need to go to traditional media or put up with the traditional media's agenda pushing and disrespect towards them. Players have avenues now. Social media has been around a long time to where they can get their thoughts out in an instant on Twitter or a post on Instagram. But with the explosion of YouTube channels and podcasts and radio shows, This is going to become the new norm, where players will just see disrespect they're getting from a media member and just decide, I'm not putting up with it. I can get my voice heard somewhere else. Thank you for watching. As always, please like and subscribe, and let me know down in the comments. Do you agree with athletes avoiding media members that disrespect them and going out of their own way to get their voices heard somewhere else?